The 17th of August 1945, the waters off the coast of Japan. The sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the deck of the USS Lexington. The war was over. The guns were silent. But aboard the carrier, a different kind of operation was underway, one that would leave an indelible mark on the minds of the defeated. Japanese naval officers, their uniforms still bearing the insignia of the Imperial Navy, walked the length of the American flight deck in stunned silence. The surrender had been signed. The Emperor had spoken. But nothing in their years of brutal training, nothing in their education about the decadent West, had prepared them for what they were about to witness. They had expected the steel of battleships. They had expected the might of military machinery. What they did not expect was the machine that hummed quietly in the galley below, churning out vanilla ice cream at the rate of 10 gallons per hour. Commander Toshiro Nakamura stopped in his tracks. His eyes, hardened by years of kamikaze raids and desperate naval battles, widened as an American sailor handed him a cone of soft-serve ice cream. The coldness against his palm was almost alien. He had not tasted fresh milk in 3 years. He had not seen sugar in quantities larger than a weekly ration in even longer. And yet here, on a ship of war, surrounded by the instruments of death, was a machine dedicated entirely to pleasure. He took a bite. The sweetness flooded his mouth, and in that moment, something shifted. It was not the taste that stunned him, it was the realization of what that taste represented. This was not the America they had been taught to hate. This was not the weakened, materialistic empire on the verge of collapse. This was something far more terrifying. A nation so abundant, so impossibly rich, that even its warriors ate dessert in the middle of the ocean. The story of ice cream aboard American naval vessels is not a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a symbol, a cold, creamy symbol of the industrial and ideological chasm that separated the United States from the Axis powers. While German and Japanese soldiers gnawed on hardtack and canned fish, American sailors enjoyed fresh ice cream made on site in the middle of the Pacific theater. It sounds absurd, it sounds frivolous, but to the men who fought, and especially to those who surrendered, it was a revelation. To understand why ice cream mattered, one must first understand the nature of naval warfare in the Pacific. The vast distances, the isolation, the endless months at sea, these were not merely logistical challenges. They were psychological ones. Morale was as critical as ammunition. The U.S. Navy understood this. And so, beginning in the late 1932, the Navy Bureau of Supplies began equipping its larger vessels with ice cream machines. By 1943, nearly every aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet had at least one industrial ice cream maker capable of producing hundreds of gallons per week. But it went further than that. In 1945, the Navy commissioned a floating ice cream barge, a converted concrete barge stationed in the Western Pacific, whose sole purpose was to manufacture and distribute ice cream to the fleet. It could produce over 10,000 gallons per week. Sailors called it the ice cream ship. It became the most popular vessel in the Navy, more eagerly anticipated than mail call, more beloved than shore leave. This was not an accident. This was policy. The United States military had studied the morale crises of World War I, where soldiers in the trenches had suffered not only from enemy fire, but from the grinding monotony and deprivation of trench life. The lesson was clear. If you wanted men to fight harder, you had to remind them of what they were fighting for. And nothing reminded a sailor of home, of abundance, of the American dream, quite like a scoop of chocolate ice cream on a Sunday afternoon in the South Pacific. For the Japanese, the contrast could not have been more stark. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of Asia, had spent the final years of the war in a state of slow starvation. By 1944, American submarines had effectively severed Japan's supply lines. Fuel was scarce, food was scarcer, rations aboard Japanese warships had been cut to the bone. Sailors subsisted on rice, pickled vegetables, and occasionally, if they were lucky, dried fish. Fresh fruit was a distant memory. Meat was almost mythical. The Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized spiritual strength over material comfort. The way of the warrior, the Bushido Code, taught that suffering was noble, that deprivation sharpened the spirit, that comfort bred weakness. Japanese sailors were trained to endure. They were told that the Americans, bloated and soft from their decadent lifestyle, would crumble under the discipline and ferocity of the imperial forces. And for a time, it seemed true. The early victories at Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, at the Philippines, these seemed to confirm the Japanese belief in their spiritual superiority. But as the war dragged on, as the tide turned at Midway and Guadalcanal, a different reality began to emerge. The Americans were not collapsing, they were growing stronger, and the material abundance that the Japanese had been taught to despise was, in fact, a source of terrifying strength. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada, a survivor of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, would later write in his memoir about the moment he realized Japan could not win. It was not during a battle. It was not when his ship was struck by American bombs. It was when he was rescued from the water by an American destroyer and brought aboard for medical treatment. He was given a clean bunk, hot food, and almost unbelievably ice cream for dessert. He wrote, "I understood then that we were not fighting an enemy. We were fighting a different world. A world where even in war there was abundance. How could we defeat a nation that fed its sailors ice cream? The ice cream machine became, in the minds of captured and surrendering Axis soldiers, a symbol of American excess. But it was more than excess. It was a demonstration of industrial capacity. The ability to produce ice cream on a warship required refrigeration, which required electricity, which required reliable engines, which required fuel, which required a supply chain stretching back thousands of miles to the factories and farms of the American heartland. Every scoop of ice cream was proof of a logistical miracle. The Germans, too, encountered this abundance, though in different forms. When German POWs were transported to camps in the United States, they were often fed better than they had been in their own army. Reports from Camp Concordia in Kansas describe German prisoners being served steak, fresh bread, and milk luxuries that many had not tasted since before the war. Some prisoners, upon arrival, believed they were being fattened up for execution. They could not comprehend that this was simply the standard diet. One German officer, captured in North Africa and sent to a camp in Texas, wrote to his family, "The Americans feed us as if we are guests, not prisoners. There is more food here than I saw in Berlin before the war. I do not understand this, people. Do they not know there is a war? But the Americans did know. They knew very well. The abundance was not ignorance. It was strategy. It was a message. It said, 'This is what we can afford to give even to our enemies. Imagine what we can do to our friends. Imagine what we will do to rebuild the world after we win.' The psychological impact of this abundance cannot be overstated. For the Japanese sailors who walked the decks of American carriers in the final days of the war, the ice cream machines were a kind of revelation. They had been told that America was a nation in decline, crippled by materialism, weakened by diversity, fractured by democracy. They had been told that the Japanese spirit, unified and disciplined, would outlast the soft, individualistic Americans, and yet, here was the evidence to the contrary. The Americans had fought across 2 oceans, sustained fleets of hundreds of ships, fed millions of soldiers, and still had enough surplus to make ice cream. The Japanese, meanwhile, had struggled to feed their own people, had seen their cities burned, their fleets sunk, their supply lines severed. The spiritual strength they had been taught to rely on had not been enough. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, was among those who toured American ships after the surrender. He later recounted his astonishment at the sheer scale of American production. "I realized," he said, "that we had attacked a sleeping giant. But it was not the giant's strength that shocked me. It was his generosity. Even to us, his enemies, he offered food and kindness. This was not the America we had been taught to hate." Fuchida would later convert to Christianity, influenced in part by the treatment he received from American forces. He spent the rest of his life as a pacifist and evangelist, traveling the world to speak about reconciliation and peace. The ice cream, he once said in a speech, was the beginning of his transformation. It was such a small thing, but it represented everything. It represented a nation that believed in abundance, not scarcity, in sharing, not hoarding, in hope, not despair. The ice cream was not just a morale booster for American sailors. It was also a tool of diplomacy. During the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, American forces often encountered local populations who had been living under Japanese occupation. These islanders, many of whom had suffered greatly under Japanese rule, were initially wary of the Americans. But the Navy had a solution: ice cream. On islands like Saipan and Tinian, American sailors would set up ice cream machines on the beach and invite local children to try it. For many of these children, it was their first taste of ice cream. The sweetness, the coldness, the novelty, it created an immediate bond. Within days, the Americans were no longer seen as conquerors, but as liberators. The ice cream became a symbol of American goodwill, a promise of the better world that would come after the war. This was not accidental. The U.S. military understood the power of soft diplomacy. The ice cream was part of a broader strategy to win hearts and minds, to demonstrate that American values, generosity, abundance, freedom, were not just propaganda, but reality. And it worked. Throughout the Pacific, the arrival of American forces was often met not with resistance, but with relief. The ice cream was a small part of that, but it was a part nonetheless. But the story of ice cream in World War II is not just a story of American abundance. It is also a story of longing. For the sailors who spent months or years at sea, ice cream was more than a dessert. It was a connection to home. It was a reminder of ice cream parlors on summer evenings, of family gatherings, of normalcy. In the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by death and destruction, that scoop of vanilla was a taste of peace. Seaman First Class Robert O'Donnell, who served aboard the USS Enterprise, wrote in his diary, "We had ice cream tonight. Strawberry. I closed my eyes and I was back in Boston, at the shop on Tremont Street, with Mary beside me. For just a moment, the war was gone. For just a moment, I was home." This emotional power of ice cream was recognized by the Navy's medical officers, who noted that sailors who had access to ice cream and other comfort foods showed lower rates of depression and combat fatigue. The ice cream was, in a very real sense, medicine. It was preventative care for the soul. And when the war ended, when the ships returned home, the sailors brought with them a deep appreciation for the small comforts they had been given. The post-war boom in American ice cream consumption was not just a result of increased prosperity. It was a result of a generation of men who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that life was fragile, that joy was precious, and that a simple scoop of ice cream was something to be grateful for. The Japanese sailors who tasted American ice cream in 1945 carried that memory for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, many of them still spoke of it with a kind of wonder. It was not just the taste, it was the realization that they had been lied to. They had been told that sacrifice and suffering were virtues, that abundance was weakness. But the Americans had proven otherwise. The Americans had been abundant and victorious. They had been generous and strong. This realization was deeply unsettling. It forced a reckoning with everything they had been taught. And for many, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. The ice cream was a small thing, but it was a crack in the ideology that had sustained the Japanese war effort. Through that crack, new ideas began to seep in. Ideas about democracy, about individual freedom, about the possibility of a different kind of society. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt under American guidance, these ideas took root. The ice cream became a symbol of the new Japan, a Japan that embraced abundance, that valued comfort, that sought prosperity rather than glory. The transformation was not easy, and it was not complete, but it was real, and it began, in part, with that first taste of vanilla on the deck of an American carrier. There is a photograph, taken in August 1945, that captures this moment. It shows a group of Japanese sailors, still in uniform, standing on the deck of the USS Missouri. One of them is holding an ice cream cone. His expression is unreadable, part confusion, part wonder, part resignation. Behind him, American sailors are smiling, relaxed, going about their duties. The contrast is striking. The Japanese sailor looks like a man from another world, transported suddenly into a place he does not understand. That photograph has been analyzed by historians, used in documentaries, reproduced in textbooks. But the most powerful interpretation came from a Japanese historian, Professor Kenji Tanaka, who wrote, "That ice cream cone is the most important object in the photograph. It represents the end of one world and the beginning of another. It is the taste of defeat, yes, but it is also the taste of possibility. For the first time, those sailors understood that there was another way to live, a way that did not require endless sacrifice, a way that allowed for joy even in the midst of hardship. That is what America offered. Not just victory, but a vision of a different future." The ice cream machines aboard American carriers were eventually phased out in the decades after the war, replaced by more modern refrigeration and food service systems. But the legacy remained. The story of the ice cream became part of the mythology of the greatest generation, a symbol of American ingenuity and generosity. Veterans would tell their children and grandchildren about the ice cream barge, about the Sunday socials on the flight deck, about the taste of home in the middle of the ocean. And in Japan, the memory persisted as well. In the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, as Japan experienced its economic miracle, ice cream became hugely popular. American-style ice cream parlors opened in Tokyo, Osaka, and other major cities. The soft-serve cone, in particular, became a beloved treat. Some historians have argued that this was not just a culinary trend, but a cultural one, a way for a new generation of Japanese to embrace the values that had seemed so foreign in 1945. The ice cream was no longer a symbol of defeat. It was a symbol of prosperity, of modernity, of the new Japan. But for those who had been there, who had tasted that first cone on an American carrier, the ice cream always carried a deeper meaning. It was a reminder of the moment when everything changed, when the old certainties collapsed, when the world revealed itself to be larger, more complex, and more abundant than they had ever imagined. There is a philosophical dimension to this story as well. The ice cream represents a fundamental difference in worldview. The Axis powers, particularly Japan and Germany, were built on ideologies of scarcity. They believed that the world was a zero-sum game, that resources were limited, that survival required conquest and domination. The strong would take from the weak. The disciplined would outlast the decadent. Suffering was noble. Sacrifice was necessary. The United States, by contrast, was built on an ideology of abundance. The American dream was predicated on the belief that there was enough for everyone, that prosperity was possible, that hard work and innovation could create new wealth rather than simply redistribute existing wealth. This was not naivety. It was a different kind of realism, one that recognized the power of human creativity and the possibilities of freedom. The ice cream machines were a physical manifestation of this ideology. They said, "We have so much that we can afford to make dessert in the middle of a war. We have so much that we can share it with our enemies. We have so much that we can imagine a future where everyone has enough." This was a radical idea, and it was deeply threatening to those who had built their societies on the opposite premise. The ice cream was not just a dessert, it was a challenge. It was a question. What if we are wrong? What if abundance is possible? What if there is another way? The symbolic power of the ice cream extended beyond the immediate post-war period. During the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union competed for global influence, the image of American abundance became a key part of American propaganda. The famous kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in 1959 was, at its core, an argument about ice cream, about consumer goods, about quality of life, about which system could provide more for its people. The Soviets, like the Japanese before them, struggled with this. They could match the Americans in military might, in space exploration, in heavy industry. But they could not match the ice cream. They could not provide the consumer abundance that the Americans took for granted, and over time, this became a critical weakness. The Soviet system, like the Japanese empire before it, was built on sacrifice and discipline. But people did not want to sacrifice forever. They wanted the ice cream. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, one of the first things East Germans did was visit West German supermarkets. They stood in the aisles, overwhelmed by the variety, the abundance, and many of them bought ice cream. It was a small thing, but it was everything. It was the taste of freedom. In the end, the story of ice cream aboard American naval carriers is a story about more than ice cream. It is a story about the power of abundance, about the importance of morale, about the difference between ideologies. It is a story about how small things, a scoop of vanilla, a moment of sweetness, can carry enormous symbolic weight. For the Japanese sailors who tasted that ice cream in 1945, it was a turning point. It was the moment when the propaganda collapsed, when the reality of American strength became undeniable. It was the moment when they realized that they had not just lost a war, but an argument about how the world should work. And for the American sailors who served that ice cream, it was a moment of pride. They understood, perhaps not fully at the time, but in retrospect, that they were not just winning battles. They were winning hearts and minds. They were showing the world that the American way, the way of abundance, of generosity, of optimism, was not just possible, but powerful. The ice cream machines are gone now. The carriers have been decommissioned, the barges scrapped, the sailors have passed into history. But the memory remains. In the archives, in the photographs, in the memoirs and interviews, the story persists. And it carries with it a simple, profound truth. Freedom tastes sweet. And those who have tasted it will never forget. The 17th of August 1945. The waters off the coast of Japan. The sun sets. The war is over. And in the galley of the USS Lexington, the ice cream machine hums quietly, still churning, still producing, still offering that small, cold taste of home. The Japanese officers have returned to their ships, their minds full of new questions, their certainties shaken. They carry with them a memory that will last a lifetime, a memory of a cone, a memory of sweetness, a memory of America, and in that memory, the future is already taking shape.